Thank you all today for coming along to our Heritage Week event, which is the Greensleeves Curators talk with Dr. Ciarán Swan and Niall McCormack. This is the launch of our new digital exhibition gallery on the Print Museum website. And I will just go into this now and show you the website itself. So I hope you can all see that there now. So this is the page we're talking about at the moment, which is the Greensleeves page on the site, just to show you that it's at nationalprintmuseum.ie, and then we're into collections and exhibitions and scroll down to digital exhibitions. So there you go. So without further ado, I just want to thank Niall and Ciarán for joining with us today. What we are doing is, I'll let the guys go ahead and have a chat now in a moment and tell us all about the project. But excuse me, just to give a little bit of background, this is an exhibition. Yeah, so it's the digital exhibition gallery on the National Print Museum website. This is very kindly funded by the Community Heritage Grant Scheme of the Heritage Council. And all put together by our CEO, Carla Marinan Funder. It's covering 4 previous exhibitions that have taken place as physical exhibitions within the museum. And we're delighted now that through the sterling work of the web designer, Peter Fitzgerald, these have now come online onto our website. So we have Greensleeves, which we have today. Print, Protest and the Polls will be launched in the next few weeks. And then it's also joined by 2 which were kind of curated and set up kind of in-house as well, which were Locked Up in Lockdown, which was the exhibition of printed material made for charitable events and things like that during lockdown, during the first lockdown in 2020. And the other one then is the fabulous exhibition of The Chapel, which was the photography exhibition with Kate Swift, Mark Henderson and Ruth Carden. And it was all images of the chapel members. And actually that can still be viewed live at the moment in the museum. So without further ado, I will hand over to Ciarán and Niall, and you can tell us all about the exhibition, how it came about in the first place, and your experiences of the digital exhibition and how that came about as well.
Okay, I'll kick off really by thanking people, because that kind of seems appropriate for the moment. First, a big thank you to the National Print Museum for getting us to this point, and to Carla Marinan, the CEO of the NPM, and thanks again to yourself, Mary. Another group I have to thank is the curatorial committee and all those who worked on the exhibition. And in a sense, this is a thank you, or a series of thank yous, to 2 separate groups of people. First, the people who were involved in the first section, the install, the material install that we had in the National Print Museum, and also the process of bringing that online today, which is what you're all here at. And indeed, thank you to all of you for being here. So in particular, I want to thank Andrew Clancy and his team, Ger Clancy and Nicola Zeidler, for installing the exhibition back in 2017, which seems an incredibly long time ago now. I also want to thank Catherine McGuinness for editing text, Pat Music for donating a beautiful painting, which is actually on the website, which you'll see. There's a group of people who were very, very important. We interviewed musicians, we interviewed artists and designers, but also people in-house in the National Print Museum, some of the print volunteers themselves, who worked in this area and were an incredible resource to have to talk about how they got record sleeves printed and what that took to be done. So people like Alf McCormack, Billy Ryan, Freddie Snow, Harry Havlin, Michael Lyon, Michael Murphy, and Michael O'Connor. Now, that's that lot of thank yous, and anybody else who's obviously involved in it, or the people who loaned us record sleeves. Again, we'll talk about how we got to that process in a short while. We also obviously have to thank Peter Fitzgerald, who in some respects it'd be great to have him talking here, because he's somebody who transformed that exhibition into this exhibition. I think they're 2 quite different and distinct exhibitions, although they contain exactly the same materials, or largely the same materials. And with that in mind, there's one other group of people I have to thank, which is the people who took the photographs of about 98 to 99% of the record sleeves. I have to thank Deirdre White, who initiated it, Maeve Robinson, who oversaw it, and Damien Long and Sarah Nolan of what is now Pierce College on Clough Road, but was St. Kevin's College, Clough Road. And in 2017, bundles of record sleeves were thrown their way and they had to photograph them. So again, thanks a million, particularly to Damien and to Sarah for doing that. But without their input, we wouldn't have had an exhibition to have here today. And again, to come back to Peter, and I think Peter's name is going to come up a lot in this discussion. So that's the thank yous out of the way. And again, thank you for being here. How did the exhibition come around, Niall?
Well, you approached me. I think you did a lot of the legwork done before I came on board. And there was you'd gathered quite a lot of record sleeves from various people. And actually there was hundreds of sleeves gathered at that point. And you approached me saying if I would be interested in getting involved, and I was happy to do so, sharing an interest both musically and in the print and design end of it as well.
Yeah.
I looked at the sleeves. I really thought that it was going to be quite a struggle to try and bring a shape on it. Now, to kind of explain the kind of rationale behind it, because I mean it's an exhibition that doesn't have Sinead O'Connor, it doesn't have the Pogues, it doesn't have the Cranberries in it. So this is not an exhibition of Irish music at all. It's an exhibition of Irish albums, and we're saying albums because we have very few singles or other formats, vinyl formats in there, which we'll explain that as well. But it's our kind of rationale for what we selected, and this is all. I think, Ciarán, you'd already had this kind of focus, on board, which was these are albums that are. Well, initially the idea was that they were all going to be printed in Ireland, and so that was going to be because it's in the National Print Museum, so that would made an awful lot of sense. But then we felt that if there was at different points albums were not being produced or printed, particularly after the early 1990s.
Yeah.
At that stage, we weren't thinking of covering. We were just thinking. The idea of the revival of vinyl was kind of, it seemed it was happening, but it didn't seem real to it. It seemed like a kind of a phantom or something. So to a degree, the plan was just to show album covers printed in Ireland, which the exhibition is mostly album sleeves printed in Ireland, but it was broadened out then to allow for albums that were released on Irish labels, so kind of whether they were printed or not in Ireland, and most of what's on show is also designed in Ireland.
Yeah,
so
that's key.
They were our kind of three kind of if they tick those three boxes, we would include them. Now there are a few things that are there's the odd very random thing that doesn't tick our boxes, but it kind of fills out the story a bit. But in terms of if you're looking at it as a musical sort of a selection, it's quite odd to and so it's best to think of it as this is kind of the activity happening in what vinyl was being used for as a format in Ireland from the 50s, more or less up to 2017 when this exhibition was launched.
I mean, you said it yourself. It's not a music exhibition on one level. That in some ways, the initial genesis, the idea was, let's look at record sleeves. And then it was, well, if we're looking at record sleeves, they're going to have some Irish connection, and it's going to be in the National Print Museum. I should say I'm on the curatorial committee of the Print Museum. So they were very keen on this. But there was a lot of toing and froing, as you said, people bringing records to the feast. And one memorable occasion, I think you saw all these record sleeves on the floor, and we kind of looked at them and thought, how do we move ahead with this? And it wasn't very clear that we could move ahead with it or that we would move ahead with it. But then I think it was key, essentially what we did was we broke the link between saying this is necessarily a music exhibition, even though it has an enormous amount of music in it. I'd say, 80% of it is music, probably more. And then once we got over that hill, it was sort of like, okay, this is about the record sleeve. I mean, this brings up notions as well as to, and we might address them, about our thoughts on vinyl and so forth, because in some way vinyl itself, although that's what's encompassed inside and wrapped inside these sleeves, isn't that important in the context of this exhibition at all.
Well, it's kind of strange by its absence. And this is one of the other kind of, we like with a lot of previous books and exhibitions of record art, what happens is an awful lot of the packaging gets lost, and we've just ended up focusing on the front cover of these things, which is only a very small amount of the physical manifestation of the record. So we don't see the labels, we don't see the vinyl, we don't see the inner sleeves or any sort of inserts, we don't see the back covers. So it is an awful lot we've left out, and to a degree it's so to do. I think if we focused in on one, let's say on a label or a printer or a designer, I think then you would have a chance to really kind of show a more go deeper in terms of showing the full materiality of it, and the full, you know, how the text is handled and how the kind of cover. I mean, because if you look at the earlier designs, the front cover is the design, and then the back is just a bit of typesetting of that, you know, of the required information. And then as you move into the 60s and 70s, you can see the full package being considered as one thing, and then as you move through, like certainly the final section of it, which was the contemporary section, which doesn't bring us right up to date, but brings us up to that sort of the beginning of the vinyl album becoming a format that artists would kind of release by default again, which hadn't been the case for a long time. The level of detail and the design is, and the printing is excellent on all of those, and they're full packages. They're not just the front cover with, you know, with little thought given to everything else. So really, this is you know, it's kind of hard to do. The ideal scenario with this is, in a way, though, I suppose it's people have records at home. People will have anyone who's kind of a vinyl sort of aficionado will have material from this exhibition at home, so they will know how they go together, if you know what I mean. But for anyone who doesn't, because I mean, there's some oddities to these things which are peculiar to Irish record sleeves, I think, especially in the 60s when in Gweiling and some of the other smaller labels, where they were doing kind of bizarre gatefolds that didn't conform to, they would a single flap front, and then the record slotted in on the inside, not on the outside. So in the physical exhibition, some of this could kind of be seen, because you could kind of go up close to them and see how these things, and you could see the type of paper stock and whether they were laminated or whether there was any embossing or any other things. So a lot of that is kind of lost in the digital realm. Yeah. But this has potential to reach a much wider audience. Now, the question is, will the broader audience, I mean, people looking from outside in who mightn't get the context for some of this material existing, like some of the Irish language stuff maybe, or the political stuff or the religious stuff, a lot of this will seem kind of quite odd and exotic and esoteric, which I'd be interested to see what the kind of people's thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I mean, that raises an interesting question. I mean, in the exhibition in the print museum itself, essentially we began to take a chronological view and then broader subject sections. So we tried to start in the 1950s and we tried to end, well, obviously 2017. You curated, in essence, a contemporary section, which we'll discuss in a little bit, but also we had not quite decade by decade, but sections within it. And then we had themes like traditionalism, tradition and modernity, and how they interacted, say, on Claddagh records, NIRC, the utilization of very strongly modernist motifs and set against presenting traditional music. moving through the time to look at, say, subsections like commercial record sleeves and all the rest of it. And quite a bit of this has survived the transition across. But what we found was, as we look back on it, that our sections had to be rejigged for the web, that the purely chronological thing wasn't actually going to work in the way that it had in the physical implementation. And I would add here, physical implementation, we thought we had a lot of text in the physical implementation, but then when we came to translate it onto the web, we began to think, well, maybe we didn't have as much text as we originally thought we did. And it seemed to be a little bit more parsimonious, I guess is the right word to say. But I think there's other small little things, like when we were framing the record sleeves, and you've mentioned this now, we didn't have the reverse showing. We literally just had the front part of the record sleeve showing. And Andrew Clancy came up with these ideas of brackets, little triangular brackets, which they sat within so they wouldn't be robbed by people, which I think is a fair enough point. But just for their own security in a sense. But even that obtruded a little bit, although really, really very marginally, into the physicality of the record sleeve. Now, it was so minor as to not really be an issue. So again, that's something we don't have to worry about in the physical implementation, or sorry, in the online implementation of the exhibition. So we kind of got to a point where I think it's fair to say that overall in 2017 it was broadly speaking chronological. Within that, we'd brought in various themes and sub themes, and we had little focuses on, say, the influence of, say, U2's Boy and how that had an impact on other record sleeves at that time. We have two, I think, very interesting examples of sleeves which were either directly or slightly influenced by it. And then we have a contemporary section, or then contemporary section, and that's more or less the space the exhibition sits in. Would you agree now?
I think so. It was after the exhibition opened that a lot of the things that, in a way, we began to look at it visually rather than by genre, and then then we realized that there was visual tropes within different genres, and that some genres were kind of mimicking international genres in an unexpected ways. And I think in the most interesting one of those, I think, is how traditional, the various forms of traditional music, so broadly, like from folk to kind of what would I say, kind of the kind of high-end traditional, or the kind of the and then the fusion and mixes of traditional with rock elements or pop or all of the different things, and an awful lot of things happened within that over maybe from the 60s to the 80s. There was this massive explosion in the music, but also in the visual interpretation of it and how people kind of sought to represent that. And so what we saw were various kind of changes. Like, I think with Claddagh particularly, and with King, there was probably more so with Claddagh, there was this, they were kind of mimicking sleeves for both jazz music and for classical music, to give it that sort of sense of prestige. So you can see that with kind of quite modern formulations of those, you know, with photography being central to it, and then sans serif typefaces, and very much, if you were to see how Irish traditional music was being packaged in America or for a UK audience by labels there, it was very kind of you know, Irish, sort of you know, green and shamrocks and pints of Guinness and that sort of thing, whereas in the Irish labels were kind of divesting themselves of that entirely and trying to show it as contemporary, as modern and sophisticated, and completely cut links. So, but that was one form of kind of how traditional record labels were kind of trying to put it across. But then it was also the Cayley thing, which had more of a, was buying into sort of touristic ideas of visualizations of Ireland. And then when you have kind of the fusion of rock with traditional music, you kind of see an explosion of things. So you've got kind of like Clannad kind of channeling, you know, sort of Californian kind of folk rock, in both visually and musically, you know. So it was, you know, after the fact, we wrote the piece for Air Ireland, which allowed us to kind of go deeper in terms of our thoughts and trying to, so in other words, there's an awful lot in the exhibition that we don't explicitly say, and because there wasn't I'm realizing now in its physical form, I don't know how many people read, even though there wasn't that much text. I don't know how many people when you're walking an exhibition space, there's usually people in front of you, and you want to look at the actual objects, and you skim over it. Whereas online, the text is much easier to digest. Which is kind of a bit worrying, because now we realize our text is, even though we've tweaked it, it feels like, you know,
not enough.
Yeah, not enough. Yeah. Too slightly vague. Although I have to say, the best thing in this version of the exhibition is the quotes from both printers, the designers, and the musicians, which really show kind of there's an awful lot of insights there that you know, on one level we're trying to analyze kind of general trends and try and make a sense of that, but we're also, you want to tell something of the story of what sort of numbers of these things were being produced, who was, you know. So there was if we have a map of Dublin printers from the period covered. Now, they weren't all active through the whole period, so some of them are active in the 50s into the 60s, some of them are in the 70s, 80s. And you can see how many places were doing record covers. Now, it says, that probably explains a lot of why the covers and the type of paper used and the way they're folded and the way they're cut and the way they're glued is quite all over the place compared to, let's say, British sleeves, where it's much more standardized, much quicker, you know. From the late 60s on, there's a kind of a standard form that it takes in terms of how it's the sort of the die cut used to make the album sleeves. Whereas in Ireland, there's a kind of we don't have the right machine for that, but you're just, you know, it'll do. And there's a real charm to a lot of that material, because it has a kind of a local sort of but worth saying, at the same time, there was major factories producing vast quantities of vinyl for the UK market to the top spec for that.
In Ireland? In
Ireland, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And that kind of what we ended up looking at is the stuff that's happening on the fringes of that, where it's an indigenous music industry or an indigenous organizations trying to promote, whether it's language or whether it's the Catholic Church or whether it's political aspirations. So they're kind of a lot of things we've got things that are hyper commercial, which are trying to make a fast buck. And then we've other things which have no hope of ever making any money, but they're trying to get their message across. Yeah. So it's the
eclectic.
Motivations are quite different for these records, and that's why the form they take varies quite a lot.
I mean, I think, like, in a sense, when we look at that was the exhibition as it was in 2017, and then Carter came to us over the summer, or the early summer, and said, right, there's funding here to digitize this. And I think our first thoughts were gulp, because it seemed like it'd be a horrifically huge project. To be honest, and again, I have to take my hat off to the people who took the photographs of the sleeves. That was a huge resource there. And now you had to acquire some images of others. We had the text basically in full format. And then we started to liaise with Peter Fitzgerald, who really, I think, took the process to the next level in terms of forcing us actually to have to rethink entirely, how did we frame it? I mean, again, did we retain the chronological stroke thematic aspect of the first exhibition, or did we, in this new iteration of it, did we go for something different? And we sort of, it's hard to describe, like, because it's exactly the same exhibition in one sense. It's exactly the same materials, but it's the old story that you can dig a narrative in so many, in an infinite number of ways out of any series of images or what have you. And we basically went back, and myself and Niall doing and drawing, and then to a degree liaising with Peter, we kind of broke it down into broader subject groups, didn't we? And, you know, looking at curious inflections between materials. So for instance, in the first one, U2 wasn't banged up against Horslips and indie and dance. But in this version, we have a broader fusion and prog and whatever, experimentalism, essentially, where those actually do work together, because we saw them as embodying certain qualities, which while they're thematic, well, genre-wise, they're not the same genre musically. There are linkages in terms of the conceptual aspect in how they worked. Horslips, and actually you were talking about Jethro Tull the other day, how early Jethro Tull, predating Horslips, sounds very like Horslips. Horslips obviously listened to that or had some sort of inflection that, you know, they had some sort of interest in it. But you have that experimentalism with Horslips. Through their career, they moved from a very traditional, of almost a hyper-traditional Irishness on their first albums, right the way through to almost a new wave sort of feeling at the end of their career. And then just the Belfast tapes, which almost has a slightly punky kind of aspect to it. By contrast, U2's Boy is a very different sort of album, completely visually, and simultaneously it sits within something that we see as somewhat experimental. You'd agree with that, wouldn't you?
Well, I think...
I hope you do.
Well, no, with the way I mean, it's hard to kind of... U2 could have completely dominated this exhibition. Yeah. Because they have kind of kept their visual production in other than the photography, for the most part, the design has always been come from Ireland. But in terms of they sit within the post-punk kind of phenomenon in when they have their genesis, and the post-punk thing is in that kind of alternatives. So in a way, we kind of saw things. We broke it down into kind of what were kind of the motivations behind these different strands that of these groupings that we'd previously made. And if we saw a similarity, so in a way, in the fusion experimental alternative thing, what they all have is that they're all kind of setting themselves up against the mainstream and trying to find a route through things from a kind of an underground perspective or against things. So it's you know, in a way, the fact that U2 went on to become the mainstream is ironic, I suppose, really. But I mean, in the kind of Boy manifestation of them, it is a post-punk record. Ticks all the boxes in terms of even the aesthetic is post-punk.
Totally, yeah.
And that fits with a kind of there's definitely an attempt, even though it is a pop record, it totally really is, if you listen to it, and a lot of post-punk was pop music, but it's kind of the motivation for it is to set itself against what they see as a kind of mainstream culture that is, you know, I mean, I don't want to ascribe a kind of snobbiness or an elitism to it, but there is an undercurrent of that within that section of the exhibition, when you kind of contrast that to the pop section, which is very kind of pretentious and very
unrefined, almost unvarnished,
and
literally and figuratively, yeah.
But also it's what's interesting is the visual kind of interpretations of these different ideas. Is, I think, what we were trying to grapple with is why is there a visual language that applies to a pop record that is different to a post-punk record or to a traditional Irish record, and where are these ones where a record comes and then it is actually using the wrong language for its genre, and why would that happen? And then sometimes that, like something like I do think Horslips are kind of central to this, because they are so kind of knowing and are but ironic, and they're really kind of smart, but very kind of they're both ultra serious about what they're doing, but ultra kind of there's a real kind of fun element to it. So they're kind of sending themselves up at the same time as doing this really, and also engaging with a kind of sense of Irishness that is kind of with a kind of slapstick version of the Irish, but very high, like a very refined and sophisticated thing as well. So they're all over the place, but there's a kind of a core value within it.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting as well. Like Charles O'Connor, I think, had experience in advertising. At least two members of Horslips had experience in advertising. Of course, U2 went on famously to have a very close relationship with Steve Averill. So they looked out, I think, with Hugo McGuinness doing the photographs. But in a way, like, and kind of moving it to the website iteration, some of that, you know, for instance, we're very fortunate. We got some materials that have been done up in the Central Remedia Clinic for the NPM exhibition, which we couldn't replicate. And we decided, for instance, we couldn't replicate them in the same way online. And we also decided not to go with 7 inches, which we had a selection of 7 inches, because basically they were really interesting artifacts in themselves, but they felt a little bit outside of the main thrust of the story that we were trying to get across online. I think that's a fair way to put it as possible.
If this exhibition is quite all over the place visually, and in terms of if the album, the form of the album takes is so kind of multifaceted, the single is even harder to pin down. It's really, because it was the ability to get a single out. It was much easier for someone to release a single than it was to release an album. So the gate to kind of the barrier to getting involved is much lower, which is great. So the 7-inch single, the Irish 7-inch single, visually is a really fascinating thing, and I think it's something we will revisit and do justice in its own right. But I think it's a story that's way more all over the place visually, and way less. I think within labels releasing albums, basically, I think each label had a core person or core people, and they had core values, and the record covers, the look of them reflects the core values of those people. So whether Garrett Brown of Clada, I think, is the ultimate epitome of a sensibility translating into a label, and the label having a very strong kind of a core identity about how it sees itself and how it sees the music. But I think that you can see that in nearly all the labels, whereas with 7 inches, there's way more labels, there's way more fly-by-night kind of activity, and there's way more. It's really interesting, but I think we just couldn't do it justice. And it would have really.
It'd be another exhibition.
Is it? Yeah, it deserves its own take, definitely.
I mean, I think we were happy with because you had to, you know, again, in tandem with Peter Fitzgerald, we had to think about how to represent these materials. And in the original exhibition, they're set on against grey panels and looked fantastic. In this one, it's almost the inverse of that. They're set against a white background and there's a shadow on them. Some of those are artificially put in, but some of them are actually from the original photo shoot. So even in the actual presentation, it's quite a different experience, I think, for people going in. In fact, actually, we'd be very interested to hear the thoughts of people who saw the original and then have had time to maybe digest the new version, and, you know, what are the differences that they see? Because in some respects, we're too close to it, and we've been living with this in both iterations for quite a long time now, actually. So it's very interesting to come back to it again at this remove 4 years later, when the vinyl revival actually doesn't seem to have dissipated. If anything, it seems to have strengthened.
Well, when we were putting this together, back in 2017. I remember, I think you showed it to me. We were beavering away, and we'd written quite a lot of text about the death of vinyl and well, more the death of vinyl manufacturing in Ireland and how that was not a thing. But then you had a piece, I think it was from the Sunday Business Post, about a new vinyl factory opening in Classen, which is Dublin Vinyl, which is seems to be doing very well and is thriving at the minute. We are back in a situation where our Irish music can be produced and manufactured on the island of Ireland, which is fantastic. And I think there's a situation even since I did the selection of kind of contemporary material. Like we've just had every year has just been this extremely strong, both musically and visually. We've just had a really and an awful lot of the material released on vinyl. So we're at a kind of we're nearly, I would say now, at a better point in terms of the vinyl culture in Ireland than we've ever been. Now it does feel slightly fragile because a lot of these releases are in very small quantities, and it's hard to know what the economic kind of imperative behind them might be, but it's wonderful to see. I mean, even since I did the selection, I just some of the albums that are not in our exhibition that were released subsequently that I think great artwork are 12 inches as well. Rachel O'Regan's covers for CMAT. Now most of them have been digital releases, but there was one 12-inch for Diet Baby, and they're wonderful sort of pop graphics. Emma Conway's done some great work for New Jackson and for David Kitt. David Kitt New Jackson is one of David Kitt's things, but also he's done an album cover for David Kitt reimagining songs in his career. They're just beautiful designs. Oscar Torrens has done some great stuff for Kojak, including the new album Town's Dead, with him appearing out of the coffin and having a pint. Dave Darcy's One Strong Arm. This is an album that just came out just as we were I think we just finished putting the exhibition together. And this should have been a centerpiece of the exhibition because it's the Ship's Procession album.
All right.
Went on to win the Choice Award that year, but they did a beautiful letterpress printed, fantastic with die cuts. It's a really extremely impressive piece of printing. Who else? Lizzie Fitzpatrick's cover, Bitch Falcon cover, the Stars Staring at Clocks. It's these kind of jellies, beautifully photographed. There's just so much stuff. Glyn Smith has done some great stuff for Lankum. I don't know if he's done the last couple of albums. I don't think he has, but the first few albums they released and when they were lynched. And I love the cover for Girl Band's Talkies album, which I think in Tran. Beautiful kind of green collage kind of.
Just when you're saying that, it strikes me that some of those, most of those are physical implementations. But because they're digital, the bizarre thing is, or the strange thing is, now that this exhibition has a digital presence, you could actually put both in a weird kind of way, because that's where the story takes us. It moves us. I mean, the record sleeve as an, the record cover, the album sleeve, as an entity, as a piece of material, as a material object in and of itself, in a sense, is now in this weird half world between being physical, where it's actually produced, or being online, and where it's not produced, where it's not printed physically. And both are entirely valid ways of pushing forward. And that, in a sense, is the story of the early 21st century. Once we hit 20. It's
got really, really strong, I think. And for a while there was only digital releases, and the kind of motivation for doing strong art for something that is going to be a little postage stamp thing was kind of strange. Whereas I think people are realizing there's a way to, the digital thing has meant there's been a major trend in the last few years. Most album covers, an awful lot of album covers now carry zero text on them. That's not required in the digital form, because it'll always have the title and the artist name will be written beside it. And then on the physical release, it's just a sticker that's applied and then that comes off it. So there's, it frees the field. It's amazing how, you know, so that's been a major trend kind of internationally, but you see it on a lot of Irish releases as well, where there's not this, whereas before, you know, the title of the artist, can you make it bigger, you know, so the whole way of thinking about what the packaging for an album is and how, you know, so it's an iconic image is really the thing. And I think we've just got some great design being produced. I mean, it's just as, and the music to go with it, and it's really diverse and really sort of
in some ways it's because the promotional aspect of the record sleeve, which is typical of it from the 50s onwards easily, has been now detached from the record sleeve as it is in the contemporary period. It doesn't need to have the same promotional thing because it's not being sold by the record sleeve in a record store. It's being sold by word of mouth or online or on Bandcamp or God forbid streaming or whatever the heck, you know. And that's, so maybe that's what allows the designers the freedom, because they have been able to pull away. As you say, you don't need to have Red Hurdy's text in huge caps on the front of the sleeve, or Dickie Rock or whatever the heck, you know, Philomena and the Country Flavor. It doesn't really matter. You can pull all of that stuff away and then simply becomes an aesthetic vehicle. Although it's one that becomes a collectible as well. There's an interesting tension there.
Driver of the current, now the one, such as the vinyl revival success, we're now at a situation where I think that the gap between the album being finished and going to be produced and coming back from the factory is around 9 months. So it's an incredible gap. That's because of the production facilities and availability and the demand.
That's staggering.
Yeah, so it's becoming a victim of its own success, I think.
Yeah. Mind you, I mean, the other side is I don't have any particular love of vinyl, because I remember Talk's Color of Spring from 1986 and having to send it back 3 times before I got a copy that didn't skip. It skipped all over the shop and it was like so frustrating.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I love album sleeves. Vinyl itself, I have this love-hate relationship with.
Thank you both so much for that. I'm going to draw you into some questions and answers, if that's okay.
Sure.
We have a question here from Colin, who said, how did you approach curating album covers from some of the Irish indie bands of the 70s and 80s who recorded on UK indie labels like Rough Trade, but used Irish imagery from Irish photographers and designers?
That's a great question.
I think that was one of the places where we kind of dropped our kind of dogmatic.
Yeah.
Because a lot of well, not a lot, but I mean, certainly with Irish artists on the likes of Rough Trade, they were all printed in the UK, and but we did include, we tried to keep it to ones designed in Ireland, and I'm actually not sure now if I look at the Stars of Heaven's Sacred Heart Hotel, I don't know if that was designed by an Irish designer. I do know the photograph was that let's see if it's here. Yeah, it was Conor Horgan's photo, and I think Kate Horgan took the photo on the cover of the subsequent the Speak Slowly album.
Yeah.
So there, yeah, you know, well, our 4 criteria were was the artist Irish, was the label Irish, was the designer Irish, and was it printed in Ireland? So really, if it ticked all 4 of those, absolutely was in. If it ticked, it was a good chance was in. If it ticked 2, we'd think about it, and if it only ticked 1, we probably wouldn't have it in there. So the Stars of Heaven does. I mean, an album cover that I love is Micro Disney's The Clock Comes Down the Stairs.
Yeah,
that's the one with the train tracks, isn't it?
Yeah,
it's a superb album cover. I don't think that they're an Irish artist, but I think that was the only. It didn't tick any other boxes.
And I'm trying to think, did we have anything from Good Vibrations?
Well, this is another because now we did have some of the 7 inches.
Yeah. Yeah, we definitely had the early 7 inches,
but
but
they're primarily a 7-inch label, and I do remember we were pulled up on that at the time as well. Obviously, we do have one with the Outcasts album.
that's right. Yeah.
I mean, if this was a survey of important Irish releases that had an impact, it would be a totally different selection to what it is now. In some instances, some of the albums featured I would say, are kind of both iconic visually and musically, and of an international importance, while other stuff is charity shop Detroit, which both are important because they're kind of, that's what we were I think we were trying to be non-judgmental in terms, we weren't trying to privilege certain releases over others. We were saying this came to exist in the kind of the Irish context of vinyl production.
Yeah.
Does it tell part of this story?
I'd add a further thought to that, which is we were very much in a sense, and this goes back to the first exhibition, but we didn't want to change it for this second and new implementation. We were very much at the mercy of what we could acquire. So, for instance, Sean Sills, my curatorial committee colleague, came in one day to me with a couple of shopping bags full of record sleeves that he had acquired at a car boot sale in Donegal. And some of them were absolutely, again, gold, fantastic stuff. He got it, I think, for 20 quid. But it was that sort of nature of stuff coming in and, putting a call out and then people being good enough to loan, in some cases, huge numbers of their, Frank Miles, for instance, huge number of his record sleeves. He allowed us not just to have, but to put up. So in that sense, it's not meant to be a comprehensive inventory or catalog of every single record producer or record in Ireland. In a sense, it's more limited. It has to be a collation, and we had to deal with what we had, in a sense. Now, I know that sounds, in a sense, like weak excuse, but there is also the fact, like, we're now in some instances 35 odd years later from when these were produced, and some of these things are very high value and regarded as such. So I think within those constraints, we were able to tell the story as best we could. I mean, there's an argument maybe we could fill it out now, but I'm not sure if that'd be true to the, now it's online, but I don't think that'd be true to the actual spirit of the exhibition as we conceived it.
The one element of the original exhibition which we have lost is the initial wall of vinyl, which was kind of set up to look kind of like a record shop display. So it didn't have any, there was no kind of logic to the placement other than it was material that kind of fell outside of some of it could have been substituted in or out, but it was just a way of telling more. Some of it can be seen in pictures on this exhibition. You can pretty much see most of that wall, but it gives you a good sense of actually this is a tiny slice of the actual activity that was ongoing.
Yeah.
And, there's definitely, there's a kind of iconic albums we don't have in there that we should, I think it's, in a way, if this goes any further, I think it would be in book form, and I think there'd have to be an awful lot more work done to really do that and give it the justice, and that would require us to start filling in rather than having something which was at the mercy of who we could kind of gather material from and from our own collections and that, but where we could actually go and actively seek out things to slot in that we know are kind of cornerstone releases in terms of, but still to keep that Irish focus and printing and Irish labels, and that it be kind of, I'm not talking about the kind of the iconic international release, Irish stuff released on major labels internationally, which is a whole other story, which isn't the thing we were trying to do here.
Well, I mean, I think it's a really interesting point about Irish photographers, Irish designers. Again, I mean, we mentioned Hugo McGuinness with you too, but also with the Virgin Prunes. And, there was this, but it was a ferment of activity at that point. Now, it changes as time goes on. I mean, on the wall of album sleeves, there's a Vaughan Oliver cover for Who was that for? Can you recall?
It was
1989, 90.
it's a piece of kind of traditional
Yeah,
O'Flynn, was it?
that's it. Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
Was.
And it was, and it's I mean, Von Oliver clearly is not an Irish designer, but it was such an interesting piece of design to have Von Oliver, famously 4AD, with all that comes with the shoegaze, etc., and the pixies and yada yada, and have that then up on the wall, because it's, again, this is why that wall of records sleeves is so useful. There's also My Hometown, a U2 bootleg. You can actually see it on the landing page of the Green Sleeves exhibition, sort of slightly over to the right on the lower line of record sleeves. But it was that sort of thing that we wanted to capture, which in some ways, I think this was an exhibition which has three components. It had that wall there, it had the contemporary section, which you've curated, and then it has the other bit between it, the sort of bit sandwich between it. And in situ, that was the three things. And then when we came to working with Peter to rethink it, we couldn't replicate the wall in quite the same way. But we were fortunate, I think, to keep the other two sections. I think that's kind of what I think.
Thanks for that, guys. Just on that, Deirdre has pointed out that the one you're trying to think of there is Micheál Sullivan. And we have a question from Fiona just asking whether graphic design album sleeves by Classen, were they any of those included in the exhibition?
There's three of those included just in the we have a broader section which is politics, cultural identity and religion. So it's in there under, so that there's three of his covers for the Catholic Truth Society, or not Catholic Truth Society, the Catholic Record Club, which was Mercer Press from Cork, were releasing these albums with, on one side was a sermon by one priest, and then the B side was another sermon. But there was about at least 30 of those that Classen did covers for in the late 60s and early 70s. And so there's three examples of those. We've gathered more since. I organized an exhibition about 10 years ago of his work, and I think there was about 15 of the sleeves at that stage. I think there's still a couple more out there that haven't been found, but they're all excellent. Like, it's such really good quality design. Unfortunately, we had a lot of Dutch designers in Ireland at the time, but Classen seems to be the only one who did album covers as far as that we're aware of.
Yeah.
Anton Mazer did an auto de fe, did some single sleeves for them, I believe, and definitely did their logo.
Did a logo, yeah.
I don't know if he did any album covers, and I'm not sure if any of the other Dutch designers. So it's interesting. We're lucky that Catholic Record Club, they've quite a release schedule. I don't know who the audience, well, the audience, I think these all went out to kind of religious communities, and so a lot of them show up in Wales at, in like from big religious where they're selling off their material in the libraries and in there. So they do come up every now and again, but they're real kind of vinyl oddities.
Well, I think we're just approaching the hour, so we I think we'll wrap it up. Thanks so much. I had a few questions, but you've answered them in the last few minutes, so you're all sorted. I just see here there's one. Yeah, there's a thank you in there. No, we're getting a few thank yous here from viewers, so thanks very much. Thanks again, Ciarán Swan and Niall McCormack, and Peter Fitzgerald as well. We'll give another call out to
thanks to Peter.
Sterling work on the website as well. And but thanks so much for giving your time today for the talk. It was great to get an overview of how it all came together, both originally and then the digitisation project as well. So thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thanks.